imagine we're going to have a few more joining us, but why don't we begin? Ivan is traveling today, so he asked me to step in as a moderator, and I'm really very, very happy to introduce Daniel Diermeier. Daniel's an old friend of mine, old long-lost friend. We were many, many years ago assistant professors together at Stanford, and since that time, Dan has had really a remarkable career. Dan has been a leading political science scholar. He's written on many topics, including legislative institutions, congressional committees, stability of government coalitions, and many other topics. And more recently, Dan has become a university leader for the last 3 years, is it? I think since 2020, Dan has been chancellor at Vanderbilt University. He has been, at least as far as I'm aware of, the most open, outspoken university leader on the topic of free speech and academic freedom. And he is going to speak to us today on 3 pillars of free expression. Take it away, Dan.
Well, thank you. Thank you so much for the kind introduction. And I'm just looking around, and there's a lot of people I haven't talked to in a long time on the call. So it's great. It's great to be back. I've seen Nabil waving, so that's good. So what I want to do today is really talk about the practice of this and the challenges that come on that one has to deal with on a day-to-day basis in leadership roles in universities today. I'll use examples from my time in dealing with these types of issues. And Jeff was, Jeff mentioned I've been Chancellor Vanderbilt since July 1, 2020. I was Provost of Chicago for 4 years before that. So when Bob Zimmer, of course, who tragically recently passed away, was president. And so I was the provost when this whole no safe space letter and no trigger warning thing came out. So I've had a lot of issues, both during my time as provost and, of course, as chancellor. I've been, as Jeff said, much more vocal on these things publicly recently because I'm very worried about what's happening at universities. And I'm also a little worried that university leaders are not forceful enough on that and not principled enough on that. So that's where I come from. When I look at the practice of this and how to think about it, I always ask myself, by every decision that I make or that I think about, is how is it connected to the purpose of the university fundamentally? And the purpose of the university, as I see it, university will do many things, of course, but at the core of it is their goal is to provide a transformative education for their students and to create an environment where faculty can do path-breaking research. And to do that, you're going to have to create the maximal amount of academic freedom and the possibility of free expression, both for the faculty and students. And so to me, this is it's not really a First Amendment issue because, of course, we have private institutions, but the way we're thinking about, of course, will be defined by First Amendment scholarship. And many of the leading thinkers of free expression, of course, have come from this tradition. But to me, the really fundamental question is, how do you ground this in a thoughtful way in the purpose of a great university? And then when you do this in practice, my sense is that there are 3 important pillars, as I call them. 2 are well known to you. The third one, I think, is underappreciated. And it's just as important as the first 2. And then there's questions about how do you actually implement that. So the first pillar, that's what's usually narrowly thought about as the Chicago principles, or what was in the Stone report, the 2015 report that Jeff Stone chaired the faculty committee, which fundamentally says we want to have the broadest possible freedom of expression on campus. And even if that's upsetting to members of our community, that doesn't mean we should restrict it in any way. So And then it would be now called as open forum. And it's fun. It's the fundamental purpose, of course, that is to allow the opportunity to speak. Now, when this becomes problematic, it becomes problematic when people don't want to hear it. So another way to say is the challenges to the open forum principles are to make sure is that we want that sometimes some members of our community and beyond want certain things not to be heard, not to be said. That's the goal. And then there are important questions about how do you operationalize and instrumentalize open forum questions. So for example, this comes up very often in the context of like external speakers, so-called controversial speakers. So I think an important question that universities have to ask themselves is who has the right to invite those speakers and under what conditions. That tends to be fuzzy and not university and not uniform on that. So at Chicago, we had a very clear rule. The very clear rule was any faculty member or any recognized student organization could invite any speaker they wanted. And then the central administration would facilitate that. I'll give you two examples of that. One is a while ago, but if you followed what's happening in Sweden and Denmark right now, this is very much kind of front page again. This was after the terrorist attacks on Charlie Hebdo. I want to say that was 2015, something like that. And the faculty members at the law school had invited the editor who had survived the shooting on campus. And we had people, FBI people on the roof with machine guns to make sure that this event could go through. Okay. But there wasn't, the university didn't approve that in any way, shape, or form, and just kind of facilitated that. The second example, which was a little later, was when I had a faculty member, friend of mine, many of you know him, Luigi Zingales. When he was running the center, the Stigler Center at the Booth School, invited Steve Bannon on campus. And that was their decision. It would have been nice if we had heard a little bit earlier about it, but it wasn't a question about approval. It was just kind of like knowing what's going on. And, as you would expect, I got immediately a letter from, signed by hundreds, I think it was like 1,500 alums and faculty and students that this is that it is atrocious and that we should retract this invitation. But it was helpful to have this policy in place, because there was not much to decide. I mean, it was basically a faculty member had to our policy had been that a faculty member had the right to invite somebody on campus, anybody on campus. He did, and some people didn't like it, and that was kind of the end of it. What was important in how to think about this is that when you have a policy like that, you want to have the format. You want to think hard about the format. So what we encouraged, we didn't require it, but we encouraged it, that the format in which outside speaker would speak would always involve some type of discussion. So at that time, we were thinking about, some kind of a give and take, or somebody makes remarks, and then there's a discussion, debate between another faculty member. And so the format was that Bannon would, say something or give some remark, and then it would be discussion with Austin Goldsby. That was the idea. And Austin was great enough to, if you know Austin, he's a very good debater, and he was happy to do that. And then the whole thing never happened because, Bannon kind of lost interest, and then so we never had the event. So that's the second piece. The third piece is very important, I think, which is it shows up whenever you have speakers that then are being shut down or shouted down. And that, of course, we just had a case of that. We had, you know this well about the controversy at Stanford. It happens all the time. And we had a very deep, very in-depth discussion about this at Chicago, about how to think about this. And the faculty senate then, after extensive discussion, passed a resolution on disruptive conduct. So the disruptive conduct policy was basically a policy to make the heckler's veto impossible. So what followed from that is that students that would shout down a speaker, make it impossible to speak, or disrupt university conduct, more broadly speaking, in a way that university can't function, would be subject to student discipline. And then there would be a proper, so just like, you know, an analogy to like a honor code violation, there would be a faculty panel, and the faculty panel would then investigate and would make a recommendation to the administration, you know, about like whatever the disciplining measure was. And we had a case, without going to the detail, it was very similar, controversial speaker, where a couple of students were suspended extensively. Okay, so that had real teeth, and it was not without controversy, but it was there. Students knew about it, and our law school students, for example, very carefully asked questions about what they can do, what they can't do. In this context, there was a whole debate about that. So that was great, I think, great evidence for us that people knew about the policy and took it seriously. And then, of course, with every case like that, you can have debates on, you know, did that good before or not, how to particularly implement it. But I thought that's an important component. If you don't have that, or you're not clear about that, it's very difficult to maintain open forum in practice. So that's open forum. Okay. Principle 2, or pillar 2, is what I like to call principle neutrality. Some people call it institutional neutrality. That is, of course, had been codified most famously in the Kelvin report. Late 60s, also chaired by a distinguished a member of the law school faculty at Chicago. And again, you know, there's a lot of detail there, but the principle neutrality, the principle or pillar basically states, well, the university shouldn't take any policy positions unless they directly affect the functioning of the university directly and in a material way. Okay. The idea there is just the opposite in some sense, right? So where open forum is about not hearing something, this is about people want the university to speak on something and the university is reluctant to do so. So the justification in the Kelvin report is about that if universities take official positions on policies, let's say on climate change or on abortion or foreign policy issues, it would create a chilling effect because people would be reluctant to speak up against the official position of the university, and that would repress free speech and open discourse in that way. That pillar turns out to be much more controversial than I would have had expected. It became a very big matter, a constant matter of contention during the Trump presidency, but it's not going away. There are, I think, there's a lot of people, a lot of members of faculty members that I think have serious, I don't want to say they don't like the principles, but they have concerns. And of course, the way this shows up is to say like, well, yes, in principle, or generally I support it, but not in this case. In this case, you have to speak up. That's the way this goes. There's also a lot of confusion about what this really means. So I want to go a little bit more into detail there. And again, of course, we can take this anywhere you want to take it later on in the discussion. So the first thing is to be clear about what's covered and what's not covered. So universities, of course, take positions on policy issues all the time. For example, you want to build, a residence hall, and you need a change in zoning law. Well, that's a policy issue. And universities will be active on that. Or Pell Grants, or research funding, or how do we think about, questions of, IP law? I mean, these are important policy issues that where universities will take positions all the time. So it's not that universities don't take positions, it's that they only take positions that affect the functioning of the university in a material way. So for example, you have to, it's not only appropriate, it's necessary. You'll have to have a point of view on the Supreme Court decision on on race-conscious admissions. Can't be neutral on that. Why can't you be neutral on that? Because, well, either you do one thing or you do something else on the admission. It affects your operations. So on things that affect your operation, universities will take positions. I think that's just obvious. But on those that don't affect the operations, they shouldn't. Why shouldn't they? Well, it's the same principle that we talked about, it's the same purpose, because of course we want to create an environment where faculty and students can have those debates, or to put it differently, we want to encourage debates, not to settle as university. We want to be a platform, we're fundamental platforms, and our goal is to be rigorous in maintaining those platforms and making sure that they are there for faculty and students to take their ideas wherever they want to take them. And so we don't want to have a party line. Now, that is very challenging for people in practice, okay? So where does this show up? It shows up in divestment, for example, okay? So many universities have decided to divest from fossil fuels. And there's ongoing pressure for students, from student groups, but also from faculty, for universities to do so. Now, the two universities where I've been associated as an administrator have very clearly stated that they're not going to divest from fossil fuels because of principal neutrality. That was the justification, okay? So how does the justification go? Justification goes something like this. It says, okay, climate change is one of the big challenges of our time. Climate scientists and economists that work in this area and social scientists will debate exactly the magnitude of that and how to think about what the models are. Well, that's what they should do. And what would it mean to divest from fossil fuels? Well, I think what it means, but again, people can see it differently, but that's how I understand it. Divesting from fossil fuels means that the best policy solution to deal with climate change is to cut off Western oil companies from the capital markets. You may think that's a beautiful idea, or you may think that's a terrible idea. So for example, some people may say, no, you have to be a shareholder, and then you want to use shareholder activism to pressure companies. That's what, some activist investors are not doing. Well, that's not the same as divesting. Or you may say that, the whole thing doesn't work very well anyway, and for every buyer, there's a seller, and so then the impact on the cost of capital is negligible anyway. You're just creating investment opportunities for others that may not have the same, kind of environmental consciousness. Or you may say that what you really need to do, that this whole thing is a sideshow and you need to invest in technologies. So Bill Gates would say that. Or you may say that this is really not for private entities. That's, good old Milton Friedman would say that's for governments to do. And what you need to do is to push for government solutions, or. So there are multiple points of view on that, even if you all agree that climate change is an important question, an important problem. But it seems inappropriate or problematic to say cutting off Western oil companies from the capital markets is the best way to handle this. That seems to me in violation of principal neutrality. Okay, so that's one example, and I'm happy to debate that. The second thing where this came up was on abortion. So we had the Supreme Court. Of course, there was a Supreme Court decision on abortion, and Tennessee had trigger laws. That's where we're located. So it would basically effectively make any type of access to abortion immediately illegal, or at least severely restricted. So, so how do we respond to that? How do we respond to that? So you can now respond to that in multiple ways. You can say, you can criticize the Supreme Court. You can say, many universities did this. It's like the university, the Supreme Court decision invalidated a woman's right to choose. Right? Criticize, if you will, criticize the Supreme Court decisions on legal grounds. We didn't think that was appropriate because our faculty have different points of view of how well argued Roe v. Wade was and how well argued this particular decision was. And we want them to debate that. So we didn't think it was appropriate for us to lay down kind of the party line, the official interpretation of that. So we didn't. But what we did do is we talked about the impact it was have on the members of our community. And then we made a decision where we would provide access to any type of medical services to all members of our community, faculty, staff, and students that were not available in Tennessee. Okay, and we would pay for that. So now you say, like, well, wait a minute, aren't you taking a position? Well, sure, I'm taking a position. I'm taking a position on benefits, right? I'm taking a position whether I want to provide this benefit or some other benefit. That's totally appropriate and right, of course. I'm not taking a position on how well Roe v. Wade was argued. That to me is principal neutrality. Now, the classic justification for principal neutrality is this chilling effect, right? But people say, people also make other arguments. They say, well, wait a minute, that's not contested at all, right? I mean, they're just things that we believe in science, and why don't you just say that? And so in the climate context, it comes up a lot. And my view is that if you just take the Roe v. Wade example, universities are based on expertise. Fundamentally, I mean, that's fundamentally what we believe. And we spend a lot of time educating our students. We have rigorous processes for evaluating our faculty. And, if you are an expert on constitutional law, that needs to be respected. And what do I know about constitutional law? I know nothing about institutional law. My faculty knows. I'm not an expert on that. So it would irritate the hell out of me as a faculty member if I spend my entire life on thinking about the constitutionality of abortion, and then the president comes and says, well, no, that's the right answer. Right? I mean, I'm also not coming out there and giving it and saying, like, what's the right interpretation of quantum mechanics? That's for the faculty. That is not an expertise that resides in the administration. The expertise that resides in administration is how to run a university. That's my, so it's the chilling effect, but it's also, I think an important question about how do we think about where expertise lies, and that the expertise lies with the faculty. It doesn't lie with the administration. So in the case of divestment, for example, it lies with people that really think hard about climate and that really think hard about policy, and finance professors. That's where it lies, and that's how we should act. Again, going back to our purpose. So it's not only the chilling effect that's important here, it's also that we want to act in a way that reinforces the importance of expertise and where it lies in our faculty, and that it's not the job of the administration to settle these types of issues where our faculty and our students have fundamentally different points of view. And then the last thing I should say on this more pragmatically, there's another thing that you hear from people where people just say, well, it's all politics after all, right? So why not be open about it? It's just a battle, and, just, put in your armor and let's go. That is very, very pernicious, I think. And I think we really have to be careful with that. It comes from the sense that everything's politicized and it's all the big battle for power. And yeah, that's probably true to some extent, but our job is to create environments where we are committed to the values of the university. And the values of the university are, may the better argument win. It's not about who's more powerful or who can muster more political clout. That's not what we're about. And it's our job, I think, as as faculty and as administrators, to stand up for these values and defend them, and rather than throwing up our hands and saying, well, it's all a political battle after. I want to say one final comment on how to apply this in practice. So the boundaries here are the boundary questions are more complicated, I think. There's some cases where it's very obvious. So I think that a great example where principal neutrality is, tells us that we should really refrain from making a point of view. It's like on, let's say, the Palestinian-Israeli conflict, right? I mean, we as a university don't have a point of view on this particular foreign policy debate. Now, our faculty, again, and our students will passionately care about that. That's okay. Then there are other cases where absolutely I want to take a position. I do want to take a position that I think, research funding is really essential and that, we need more of it. I'm going to take a position, and that's a policy position, but it's a policy position that directly affects the university. So what's the boundary here? What's the principle? My sense is a good principle is to say, whenever you have an issue that affects the members of our community more than anybody else, that's something that is at least possible for us to take a position on. So we remember during COVID, the immigration restrictions on students, right? Well, they hurt or they affected our graduate students more than what you had other members of the community. So I think it was appropriate to take a position on that. Now, some people say, well, wait a minute, abortion has or more broadly, climate change or macroeconomic policy or minimum wage or unionization or whatever policy you think has an impact on our community. I think that's true, but it doesn't have a differential impact on our community, right? It's not something that affects university members more than if you're just living in the community. So I think that's a heuristic that I think is at least useful to explore. I don't think people have given this a lot of thought, but I think it's very important to be sharp about that. And then the last thing I should say, again, somehow hard for people to wrap their hand around that. Even if we make a decision on a policy issue, such as I want to have an expansion of NIH funding. That's my call as a university administrator, that I'll support that. It doesn't mean that the faculty and the students cannot criticize us. Of course they can. They can still criticize us, but it's our call. What are we going to do about it? What's our decision? At the end of the day, or if there's a shared governance aspect of how we work through that. So sometimes people say, no, once these are our values, you can't even criticize it. This shows up, for example, in EDI context, right? So with so we have a commitment to diversity and inclusion. We have it but our faculty can criticize how we do that, of course. And then we'll have a debate, we have a decision on that, and we may make a decision that people don't agree with, but doesn't mean that we can't even discuss it. Of course we can discuss it. We can discuss that, just like we can discuss on, whether we want to have a campus in China, or whether we want to open a dorm in Berkeley. These are all open for discussion. They affect the university materially. So of course the university will take a decision on that. And of course, our faculty or students are free to criticize the university on that. They're free to criticize the university on anything anyway. So there are no limits on that. So that's another thing, I think, where people feel like, well, once we have a value or once we have a particular policy, that means we can't even criticize them. Of course we can. So that's principal neutrality. I'm a little beyond my allocated time, Jeff, but I'll just grab 5 more minutes, okay, to talk about the last one.
Sure.
And I think that's a little underappreciated, and that's not so much a principle. There's more a question of culture, okay? And so at Vanderbilt we call this civil discourse, and people people have called it differently. That's the term we use. And what's that all about? That's about that's a cultural thing. That's a cultural thing where you say we're members of one community, and we go into that discussion with a sense, with kind of like, with having good intentions, with a sense of like, you're members of one community, and I'll owe you to listen to you, and I'll owe you to give you a chance to make your point of view clear, and then we'll argue in a way that's respectful. Okay? Now, that is not a Chicago principle. Yeah, that's not in the Stone report. That's not in the Calvin report. That's not there. It's not a practice. But I think that this is important. And where this shows up is mostly student to student, but now in Cree, I've also seen it faculty to faculty. What do I mean by that? Let me go back. This is a real case that I'm sure you all have at your universities. We've certainly had it. This is over Israel-Palestinian conflict. And it's a very, very interesting case study because it runs counter to the typical narratives that I think that we're familiar with. So for those of you that are not deeply in this, the way this works is that there is one group of students that very, very strongly are opposed to Israeli policy. I'm not talking about the Supreme Court stuff right now. I'm talking about the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. And they are drawing parallels between Israel and South Africa. And then they're looking at this conflict through an anti-racism paradigm, if you will, or through an anti-racism lens, which basically says, okay, there are, in South Africa, there were structural, systemic characteristics of that particular state that excluded Black South Africans. Israel has structural features that's excluding Palestinians. So Israel is racist, structurally racist. And it's now, and this is the important part, it's your responsibility as a moral citizen or as a moral member of your community or university community to actively work on dismantling this racist structure. And if you're not doing it, then you're racist. Okay. So you remember, one important part of this paradigm is there's no neutral thing. Either you're supporting or you're not. And if you're not, then I can call you racist because by your silence, you're perpetuating a racist structure. That's the argument. The students that make those arguments, many of them, there are some Jewish students on, in Israel they call the Israeli left there. There's some Muslim students. There are some sympathetic students, many of them African American actually. And then there's the other side. The other side in the student body are pro-Israeli students. Again, many of them Jewish, but also some other students. They're saying, well, my grandparents, survived the Holocaust. How dare you call me racist? And oh, by the way, 3 years ago, we were all marching arm in arm when George Floyd was killed to protest, police brutality and inequality. And why are you singling out Israel in the first place? That's anti-Semitic. So what I'm now having and what's happening on campus is I have one group of the students calling one racist, the other calling the other anti-Semitic. Now, the interesting piece to me is that this has absolutely nothing to do with polarization in the traditional way we think about a Republican Democrat, because these are both members of the progressive left. And they agree on many, many things, but on this issue, they don't. And on this issue, they passionately don't, and it can absolutely rip a student community apart. Okay, absolutely. Now, in this particular case, you had two groups. Okay, and one was calling other racist, one was calling the other anti-Semitic, with vitriolic rhetoric on both sides, literally ripping a university community apart. Well, at least a possibility. Now, if you just take open discourse and principle neutrality, that's where it ends. Well, that's free speech. They're calling each other names. But we just went through that calling each other names is perfectly consistent with free speech. And I, as a university leader, or university has no point of view on Israel-Palestine anyway. So it's consistent principle of neutrality, but it's creating this tremendous drama in the student body. And I think it's worthwhile in these cases to encourage civil discourse among the students. I think that's useful. So that there's a culture that we're not immediately reverting to name calling. Now, I know that this is, you know, that some people, that's deviating from the pure Chicago principle, you know, because at Chicago, people wouldn't do that. It just would be that. I don't think so, because I think that that the Chicago principles were fundamentally defined in relationship, they were, if you will, vertical in structure between the administration and the students, what people can do and how the administration should position itself. This is different. This is about the relationship between members of our community, and having a culture of civil discourse, I think, is really important. It's even more important when there is worry now, which I think there is tremendously. Difficult to pick this up in a specific case, but the survey data, I think, are unambiguous, is that in contrast to this particular example where you had two sides, and one side were pushing back, now you have an issue where there's nobody pushing back. And so people are worried to challenge a conventional point of view, because if they do so, they'll be called racist or sexist or transphobe or whatever it is by their fellow students. And that is really serious. That's very serious for the students, because they lose their friends. They're being ostracized, and they're basically being cut off networks. And that's true both for undergraduates and for professional students. So I was really interested in that. I don't know whether you've seen it, but there was an op-ed piece by a Stanford law school student who was basically describing that there's this consensus. And, you know, she's like, you know, she described herself as kind of center left. But that, you know, she was worried about speaking. In some cases, was like, I don't really agree with that. But that if you do that, you're being ostracized from your group. Okay, and that's a very difficult dynamic, and very pernicious, I think, in university context. So I think this is something that's also worth thinking about. It has a different flavor, and I think has a different standing than open discourse and principle neutrality, but I think it's a big deal. I think it's true for faculty too. I think faculty are worried now that they will challenge a particular, you know, kind of policy or point of view in their department or in a professional association or something like that, because they're worried about being ostracized. And that's very, very hard to fix just by talking about open discourse and principle neutrality. This is something else. This is about, you know, if you will, a politicization or, you know, inability to have a culture where we can treat each other as peers and with respect, and where there is a kind of a sense that you know, that we give each other the benefit of the doubt first. So those are just a couple of thoughts of how to think about that. As you probably can tell, I feel pretty strongly about this, and I'd love to hear just your point of view. I think some of the things will be familiar, some of the things you will disagree with, and I think that's great. So Jeff, are you going to pick people? Or
yeah. So thanks a lot for that great talk, Dan. We'll now open things up to questions, though I will use my host prerogative to ask the first question here. So Daniel, you spoke a lot about institutional neutrality. You mainly talked about sort of neutrality from your position, from a chancellor or president or provost. Yeah. In my experience, I found much more problematic the many administrators and faculty who implement many small policies that routinely violate the principle of neutrality and convey in many important ways, really career-changing ways, the view that if you don't, if you have the right politics, it will benefit your career. And if you express the wrong politics, it may harm, possibly even end your career. One example is just the admissions process throughout universities and hiring process throughout different departments, where many, it's well documented in many senses, and across many different departments and admissions, expressing the right political views will get you admitted, and expressing the wrong political views will be disqualifying. So I guess my question for you is, as a chancellor who wants to implement institutional neutrality, how do you deal with, or what are your thoughts on dealing with the many ways throughout the institution that institutional neutrality is violated?
Okay, so very important question. I have two thoughts on that, and because you gave a whole kind of general things, I'm just going to pick two examples of that, and then we can go deeper or take it in another direction if you want to. So the first one is where this comes up quite a bit, are statements by schools or departments. Okay, so we, the English department, or we, the school of so-and-so, believe. I think that's just as problematic as a university statement. Okay, and for exactly the same reasons. It creates a sense of a party line. It chills, disagreement, and in this case, the dean or the chair of the department assumes a level of expertise that isn't located there in the right way, or shouldn't be located there. So the way I think one can do that is to say, of course, faculty can make those declarations, but then they should do it individually. So another way to say this, it's not we, the anthropology department, but Professor Zwiebel, who is a cultural anthropologist, signs on to something. Okay, so for example, my former employer, Northwestern, has this, huge controversy over football right now, and there was a faculty statement, and I don't know how many it was, 380 or 400 people signed their name, and that was it. That's unproblematic, I think. But if you were to have in this case, we, the law school, our pros, that's just as problematic. So that's one example. The other example is on hiring and promotion. So we haven't talked about the third. That's the kind of the third of the trifecta of University of Chicago, but that's the Schills report. The Schills report, of course, says, again, I'm paraphrasing, there's more subtlety in there, but just like it says, tenure and promotion need to be based on research, teaching, and service, and nothing else. The nothing else is always forgotten. Okay, so in particular, political point of view, personal values are not to be taken into consideration during promotion and tenure. Okay, so that's that. Now, it cuts kind of in both ways, though, if you really do that. And we were absolutely implementing that in Chicago, at least, during my 4 years when I read all the tenure files. And we had, discussions on that. So sometimes you hear people say, well, we should have more conservatives on campus. Well, that doesn't work with the Schills report, right? Because that's not, being a conservative or not, or a liberal that's just not part of being hired, promoted, tenure. So I think, it's like, if you that's one way to go with that. I like that a lot. But people may have a where do the conflicts come in? Of course, people come in a conflict when there's a faculty member who has a particularly radical point of view or something like that. But I think we are, all we do in the whole point of tenure has been traditionally to protect our faculty members, to have the ability to speak their mind, right? And so having policy along the lines where you're saying, well, no, somebody's particular point of view cannot be a criterion for promotion and tenure is one way to go. I think that's pretty workable, and has worked well at Chicago. We're implementing it at Vanderbilt as well. We don't have a beautiful report like that, but we're doing it in practice. So those are two responses. There may be others, Jeff, that I didn't touch upon, but those are the two that come to mind.
Hey, Jonathan Burke.
Okay,
I
Daniel,
love your podcast. I love your podcast. I love your podcast.
I appreciate that. And thank you very much for a very interesting talk. And I agree with you on most things. The one thing, though, I don't agree with you on is how you defined neutrality of the university. I don't think it's a function of whether the university is more affected or less affected. I think it's a function of the objective of the university.
Yes,
if taking a position is consistent with the objective of the university, then the university should be taking a position. So let's go to your example. The example of divestiture, it's not an objective university to lower the return on the endowment, quite clearly. Divestiture would lower the return on the endowment. Therefore, it's not a position the university should be in. The fact that there's disagreement of how we should deal with climate change at the university amongst its faculty, I don't think has any bearing on the fact that the university objective does not include whether or not the climate is changing.
Okay, so maybe I didn't say that right, but let me try again. I don't think we're disagreeing on this one, but maybe I didn't say it in the right way. So my point of view on divestment, right, is that, and this is our policy that has been very well articulated in Chicago. It's the same policy at Vanderbilt. Is that the purpose of the endowment is to support the faculty, the work of the university, faculty and its students. Okay, and as such, it needs to be invested in a way that the returns are maximal in order to do that. That's how I understand the role of the endowment with a commitment. Now, I don't think people are arguing. Some people, there's always confusion. Some people argue, well, divesting, if you divest from fossil fuels because it's, there's all these risks associated with it, doesn't maximize the endowment in the first place, role of endorsement first, but it's just smart investing. Well, if it's just smart investing, I don't have a problem with that. And I don't think you have a problem with that. Then it's just that, So the only interesting case shows up when you're making an investment decision where you believe or you expect that the returns are low. That's the only interesting case.
Yes.
And then people argue and saying, well, what's the argument people make? People make the argument they're saying, well, that's the moral thing to do. You just have to read the statements of like many of the universities that have done that. That's the moral thing to do. Or we have to set an example. I mean, I don't think what else is the justice? I don't know. It's like something like it's a sense of, it's the moral thing to do. Well, my point is that what I was saying is like what the right thing to do in this case, what is the moral thing to do, is contested. And it's contested among people that are real experts that think about, climate policy every day.
Let's say, I mean, I don't think it's in the objective of the university to be moral. It's not one of the objectives. You can make it an objective, and then if you make it an objective, my God, you open a Pandora's box of zillions of universities. What?
So I think, I tell my faculty that I think that we're doing noble work, and I do believe that. So I think that by what we do every day, we're a tremendously moral institution because we're allowing people to realize their potential and giving opportunities. So I wouldn't go that far. But I don't think we're disagreeing on that. I'm telling you is that that's the point people make. And I think that you don't have to engage with a debate on whether you agree or disagree. You can say, I think very coherently, is that that's a great debate to have, right? Have it, but I'm not settling it for you. That's my point. So I don't think we're that far apart.
All right, let's move on. Sarita, you are up.
Thank you so much for your talk. And I think you made some really great points about the principle of neutrality as it applies to a large corporate body. So it makes sense a great deal as a policy and a philosophy for administration. And even as you said just recently, even the mini corporation of like a department, for instance, saying collectively, we in the politics department voting yes on issue 53, whatever else it is really not appropriate. And I think the principle here, correct me if I'm wrong, is that we assume that there will be pluralism in the academy. And we welcome pluralism actually as a way for us to facilitate growth intellectually and perhaps even morally. And therefore, the university itself will not take any position formally to allow there to be a multiplicity of opinions, kind of in a deliberative sense. Tell me if I'm wrong, it seems as though this tacitly puts a great deal of trust in your faculty members, because somebody has to make a decision about who it is that's coming to address the larger community, who is given a platform to tell us about their opinion on this, that, or the other thing. And so it seems to me that you're just trusting your faculty implicitly that whoever it is that they invite to campus has merit and should be invited on a certain level, and the administration is going to assume that that person is appropriate. I was wondering though, is there any sense of responsibility though that you would like to foster in individual faculty members? Are there wrong people to invite or right people to invite? Perhaps not ideologically, but do we assume that our faculty members are, for instance, inviting somebody who has some sort of intellectual merit that we think would be really helpful for the students and faculty to hear out on a specific kind of issue, rather than just kind of an activist, I like this guy, he's saying the things that I like. And I think that the line is often blurred between like scholarship and activism. And that could be part of the reason why it's become quite controversial to ask certain people to come and to give them a voice when what it is that they're doing is perhaps more properly activist than intellectual or scholarship.
Yeah, so the first thing is, you heard this right. I think, as administrators, we have to put a lot of trust in our faculty and students. I think this is important. And that they handle this with thoughtfulness. And that's the first comment. If you think about the idea is that anyone in a community can invite anybody and we will support that, puts a lot of responsibility there, right? That's also true, of course, for faculty members, their individual statements, right? So what we do is, you will not be shocked to hear this, but there are cases where people, where faculty members take very extreme positions. Usually it's in the it's on like some talk show or Twitter or something like that. It's not in a typical, kind of scholarly format. And we've always said, it's like, we're very expansive on that. So even if you do it on Twitter, or even you do it on like, Fox or MSNBC, that's part of what we want you to be active on that. Everything that's equal. So we'll consider this part of what you do. But then people say sometimes, whoa, I'm like getting, I'm getting all this pushback. And people say very nasty things on me on Twitter, and I want you to sue them for libel. No. Okay, so that's your business now. Okay, so this is that's an example of the individual responsibility, right? And then I think an important part here is to make this. A lot of these things are nuance in how you do it, so that it doesn't always become this like, Manichaean, like a good versus evil thing, right? It's like if you have somebody, I always encourage people, but again, it's not a hard and fast rule, but it's an encouragement to say, when you bring people to campus, there needs to be a possibility for debate. Okay, it could be, point counterpoint. It can be people questioning, even aggressively questioning. It can be, counter programming. It can be all sorts of stuff. So, a stump speech and then, you go home. That's not so good. It's why is it not good? Because it doesn't foster the scholarly mission of the university. It's about interrogation. It's about questioning. It's about, going beyond the obvious. So do that in your events too. That's the guideline. Think about like a guideline, okay? And I think and then people do a good job. I'm doing this for 7 years now. I don't think I've had a case where I would say like, good Lord, what were they thinking? Right? It's more like you give them, but it's like in a tenure decision. You give faculty, a lot of responsibility. Usually they do a good job with it. And there are cases where you have to maneuver a little bit and do this and that. But I like the way you said this. It's like putting a lot of trust in your students and faculty. Yes, I'm in favor of that.
John Etchemendy, you're up next.
Hi, Daniel. How are you?
Good to see you again. Good to see you.
So you won't be surprised that I agree with almost 100% of what you said. But as you also know, these are really complex issues, and there are difficult cases. I have a few questions about your approach. One is your discussion of the visa immigration policy and justification of the university getting involved or making, adopting a position because it differentially affects your community. I don't think you have to go that way. I think in that case, we went through that, in 2016, and it directly impacts the functioning of the university.
Yeah.
Your students can't arrive on time and so forth and so on. And so there's no need to come up with some other justification for that policy position. One of the things so divestment is an interesting case. We constantly had demands to divest from obviously fossil fuels, private prisons, et cetera, right? And unlike Jonathan, I actually think whether it's part of our mission, I think we should be ethical. Well, it's not necessarily the goal of the university. But what the test I always used was, are they asking us to divest in order to make a statement, for us to make a statement? Are they trying to force us to make a public statement? Or are they telling us that what you're doing by investing in this company is immoral? And the question I would ask them is, would you be happy if we decided to divest, but we made that decision secret? We did not publicly announce that decision. And of course, their answer always is no, they want the statement. That's what they're interested in.
Yeah.
In which case, it is not, they're asking us to violate our principles of not adopting a position on these issues. So I think there's a good test to use. Can you do silent divestment? Would that satisfy the people who are demanding the divestment? And the answer is no. And so this is obviously not about an ethical action. It's about trying to force us to make a statement. The last thing I want to say is that I agree completely with you about, the English department should not adopt policy positions any more than the university as a whole. But what about policy institutes? So I'm currently co-directing a policy institute, and I actually asked myself a lot, is this part of the mission of the university to make, a policy pronouncement? We think that this law should be passed. We think that this is how you should regulate this issue. And I struggle with it. because we as an institution, as a sub-institution, are not adopting neutrality. Now, what do you think about those cases?
Okay, so I hope I remember all of them. So I think I start with the first one. You're absolutely right. There are many cases, and immigration, I think, is a clear case where it just, it just affects the functioning of the university, and you don't have to go further than that. The reason why I brought up this other criterion is I've heard this many times when people said this. They said like, well, so one student once told me that this is what started my thinking on it. So this came up on this divestment business. I come back to the divestment in a minute, but I think your distinction is very interesting. She said like, well, climate change affects the members of our community, right? I mean, I have this friend whose village is affected by climate change. What do you mean it doesn't affect the members of our community? So in this case, I think it's like, well, you can, if you go down that road, of course, every policy position affects members of our community in some way. Minimum wage and foreign policy, there's some way in which it does. So in those cases, I think where you need to go beyond the obvious, I'm going to call it, John, it's something that I think is useful, is to see, is it like is there something about the university here that is bigger than just being a citizen of the world or a citizen of this country? That's where it comes up. But you're absolutely right. There are many, many cases where you just don't need it. The second question, I like that very much. It's like public versus private. I think that's a very interesting heuristic. And of course, this goes back to Jonathan's point, I think, on the kind of like, how do we think about the impact of what we do? A lot of what we're asked to do on the Kinder Principle is purely symbolic, right? It has no direct impact. The whole point is just that, is just to make us, statements have that. And, for condemning this or the other. And, foreign leaders don't necessarily shake in their boots because, my faculty, because the university makes a statement. So it's purely symbolic. And But I think what is this about deep down, right? It's like, it's not about, I don't think people believe that they're really having an impact. I think there's one question is that the university has a moral authority, right? And they want that that moral authority to be brought to bear. That's one motivation. I think the other one is that people, you gotta love them for that. They love the university. Right? I mean, people are really, really attached to their university, whether they are alums or students or faculty, to the point where when they go to the gym, they wear a t-shirt with your logo on it. I mean, where else do you have that? It's really part of, being a Stanford alum or like Vanderbilt or Chicago. That's a really important part of somebody's identity. And so they want the university to match their values because it reflects on them in some way. And I think that's where a lot of that comes from. It's not really about having the discourse is about having an impact, but the real motivation is about, I want the university to reflect my values. I want to be proud of the university, if you put it this way. So this is a great example where you just see the difference in motivation very clearly. The last part on policy institutes, I don't think that's not that different either. I think that policy institutes or policy schools should be forums for where faculty can take positions, and it's kind of like a fractal, right? I mean, like, I was talking about big things now, but now you're going to the policy thing, and on like exactly what should we do with respect to, what should be the policy with respect to Ukraine and which weapons should be delivered and which one shouldn't. People disagree on that as well. So I think that the direction should be the regulative principle should be try to be as neutral as you can and provide a platform for faculty at every scale. That would be the guideline that I think, at least to me, makes sense at this point. Back to you, Jeff.
Juan, you're up next.
Yeah. First of all, thanks for your talk. At Stanford lately, we're not used to leaders embracing free speech, so I appreciate that. I thought maybe I was on the wrong Zoom. I wanted to make a kind of push back on one idea. Again, I agree with almost everything you said. And you made an argument about the lack of expertise being a reason why the university shouldn't weigh in on the constitutionality of some law or other. What I find the problem with that is the university, at least at Stanford, what I see is university administrators, they choose to back or adopt one small group of experts versus another. So then they claim to have expertise, or you see a group of faculty tacitly backing, with a tacit backing of like the central administration, seek to censor the speech of others by saying, "Oh, you need to stay in your lane." So I kind of think the lack of expertise is just a bad argument all around. I think we need to talk about like the negative rights of the administration. Okay, that the administration has certain policy rights, but things like it should not make statements, it should not take positions that are either moral or political. So anyway, what do you think about that?
I don't know whether we disagree or not. I'm not sure. Okay, so let me put it. I think I don't think you can say that the university should not take positions, you know, in that generality, because you simply cannot function as a university if you don't, right? And the example would be on, like I said this before, right? Look, I'm a great research university depends on research funding. Or the endowment tax. I mean, take that as an example. I will absolutely take a position on endowment tax, absolutely, and because I think that's that allows the university to function. Now, you may disagree with my position on that. God bless you. That's fine, and you may think that endowment should be taxed and should be taxed more. That's great, but as a university leader, I'm entrusted, I think, by the board to make sure that university flourishes as much as it can. Fulfills its purpose, and I don't want people's generosity to be taxed. I don't want it. It's bad.
I didn't argue that they should take no position. I say that we should enumerate the subjects or types of things that they should not take a position on.
That's fine. I think that's fine. I'd rather than enumerate, I'm giving you, I think, what I think is a principle on that, right? If it directly affects the functioning of the university, I will take a position. Or at least they will have the freedom to take a position. If it doesn't, it doesn't. And then we can have then how exactly to do that. I had this a heuristic that I'm using, and John commented on that. So I think that's so I don't think, do we disagree on that or not? I'm not sure, because I don't think we are. And then I want to know where we're disagreeing.
Yeah, I guess what I'm saying is, but my main comment was lack of expertise. I think it's just a poor way to go, and a more useful is limiting what the administration can and cannot do.
Okay, I got it. Let me go back. This is something that Sarita said. Okay, so here's why this is, I think, is important. So when you read the Calvin report argues that the Calvin report's fundamental rationale for principal neutrality is a don't chill debate argument. Okay, now that's what the no party line, and that's great when you have, Sarita called it pluralism. If they're pluralism of ideas, right? So my example of Roe v. Wade, well, there's pluralism of thought, and people have different points of view, and so all right. So we want to create an environment where people feel free to debate this and argue for that without worrying about being censored from the university. I think that's clear. But you listen, some people have argued, no. There are certain things where the debate has ended, where science has spoken, okay? Where, this is just the facts, right? And you can obviously that where this came up dramatically was during COVID, but it comes up in many other domains, right? Where people say, no, that's settled. The science, follow the science, right? And so I need you as a university leader, because you're a scientific institution, to articulate, scientific consensus as the official position of the university. So that's a the other argument is there is a pluralism, or, you know, we're outside of the Overton window if you like, you know, if you disagree with that. And so the traditional Schilling pluralism, it doesn't catch there, I don't think, or doesn't catch in the same way. But what's very important is like, what is consensus and what is established and what is debated and what is reflected and by what standards resides in the faculty. And it resides in, you know, the scientific or the academic process. It's this kind of, you know, beautiful self-organizing thing. And, you know, it's not the job, I think, of the university leader to decide to declare these things settled one way or the other. I don't think so, because, and that's where I think that you can say, well, A, because we want to encourage debate, got that, but B, because it's for you guys to figure this out, not for me. Right, and it's not for, well, what do I know about quantum physics or COVID really deep down, you know, or like or any type of any issue of complexity. That's for faculty. That's where expertise resides, and so that's a separate argument, as a separate justification that comes up, I think, in the context where people say, well, that's settled, and of course, people that usually say that's settled have no idea, because they're not inside the debates and they don't understand the nuances, and they just come in with some kind of general statement. That is the tendency for general statements that does not reflect where the scientific community really is that's the worry to me there. Does that help a little bit, Juan?
No, I think so. And I think where we agree is that individuals should not try to express the opinions of institutions, of departments.
Yes.
It might be okay if you as a president think we should all wear masks, and you have a policy, but you should defend your own opinions, and you shouldn't say that it was the science that
that's right.
Yeah.
So if you let's take that, right? Great example. So we will have to make a decision on whether people wear masks or not.
Mm-hmm.
That's you know, that's what we do as leaders, as administrators, clearly within the scope of what we should do as university leaders. But if some faculty member says, well, you know, here's why we shouldn't wear masks, and here's my argument for that, they can say that. And then within the public health community, you know, there should be a debate on that, whether it's a good argument or not, and fine. You know, that's important. That should happen.
Yeah, makes sense.
So I have to say, I share with Juan his unease with wrapping things up in terms of in terms of expertise. We've just seen too many examples here at Stanford of the lack of expertise argument being co-opted by university leaders to try to silence others. You know, we've seen Jay Bhattacharya and Scott Atlas stigmatized by university leaders because they supposedly spoke without lack of expertise. And so,
I see what. Now I understand. Now I understand what you're saying. Now I get it. I get it. I get it. Yes.
This is the, you know, you've got to stay in your own lane.
Yeah.
If you.
Yeah. That's now I understand what you're saying. I think this is very different. I think this is what I'm talking about is really the role, right, of university leaders to declare themselves that are non-experts to be the arbiter of truth. That's my only point. I'm not. Now I understand what you're saying, and that's that. By the way, that's I think it's just as problematic in this case, you know, because what do I know about? You know, I mean, we're like there needs to be deference to the scientific community. Now, I understand that the scientific community is not, you know, is like making there's things problematic there as well, right? But it would be much more problematic for us, from the university's point of view, purge is to make this pronouncement that this is the case or that's the case. That's my only point. And now I understand the context.
Nabil, you're up next.
Yeah, Daniel, thank you for the talk. Enjoyed it.
Good to see you again. Good to see you. Yeah.
I have two related questions on the boundary of the things that you spoke about. And so if we recognize that there's a problem with universities and free speech and free thought even, then two questions would be, one, do you think the university structure with the tenure process and faculty selecting their colleagues and so on and so forth have the capacity to reform internally, autonomously? That's one. And the related question is that is a policy question, whether there's room for top-down intervention by funders of universities. This is typically at the state level for public schools would be the states, but also at the federal level, the federal government has a lot of say in terms of how universities are funded and their endowments are taxed and so on and so forth. So I would be interested in hearing your thoughts about this.
So I'm a kind of Humboldtian on that, I like the fundamental idea that universities need to be free from political interference from the top to the maximum extent possible. I think that this is a very, very problematic thing, kind of almost for obvious reasons. I am more optimistic. So I think you can have the following two thoughts in your mind. One, that right now universities are not, in general, well, let me put it this way. There's a problem with free speech and the principles of universities at various universities right now. And I think that, the leaders need to step up, and that includes, this is a shared governance model that includes the administrators, that includes the faculty, that includes like the representation of the faculty, that includes the board, to tighten that up and to make sure that we are all super clear about what the fundamental founding principles and constitutive principles of the universities are. And then we can have debates exactly about how to implement them and this and that, but we have lost our plot on that a little bit. So I think you can say that. And you can say that intervention from, whether it's state or federal governments would be really problematic. I think both of these things, I think one can have both of these things in one's head. And my sense is that, and people say, well, you're already a public institution because you're getting public funding, but, we have all sorts of institutions that have semi-independence, like central banks and stuff like that. We're set up because we believe they function better if they are removed from the constant interference of the political process. And I think universities are in that category. So that's my view on that.
And how do you feel about how optimistic you are about the university's ability to self-reform in terms of having a more open environment for thoughts and ideas and speech and visitors and so on?
God, why is that? It's like I think that many people feel very similar to, I don't want to speak for everyone on this call, how you feel about it, why you're on this call, but feel that this is not going in the right direction. And I think the tide is turning a little bit. That's that. Now, do I have evidence for that or quantitative evidence? Not really. But what I've noticed is, when you are, in my own experience, and again, I've done this behind the scenes at Chicago, and I'm doing it more publicly now in my new role. You get a little flack, but it's not so bad. You just get called names all the time, and I've been called anti-Catholic once. I don't really know why, but there's something I did and I was considered anti-Catholic, but I've been called every name you can imagine, okay? And you know what, and you just move on. And so it's like, and I don't want to minimize the pressure that people have and so forth, but clarity of that and some conviction goes a long way. And having groups of people that think about this similarly and can support each other is hugely important.
Richard? You're muted.
Okay. Yeah, thank you, Daniel. I've always appreciated the attitudes at Chicago. I was once a professor there. But universities obviously do not act alone. And with respect to the issue of climate, by the early 90s, I think it's fair to say anyone who opposed the official narrative was going to lose funding and have great difficulty publishing. And if you were a junior faculty member, you would have zero chance of promotion. And this was not from the university, this is from the outside. And so opposition to that, and it is far from settled, was ended. And so the university, which within a given department, let's say geophysical sciences at Chicago, could only have people who supported it, ended the role of expertise. How does the university deal with such situations?
I think you're right to point out that this is not just a problem for universities, that it goes beyond that. It can be a part of funding, it can be part of professional associations, it can be part of it can be part of the whole ecosystem, if you will, of science and research. And I think there's no substitute for people that have a particular that feel strongly about this to be engaged with that and to do the work. I mean, I don't know that I don't think there's anything else magical there. I think whether that's university or faculty that sit on panels for funders, or it's this is about be clear about what your goals are and try to do it every day. Which I don't think there's a magic, I don't think there's a magic solution to that. Other than that, is to do the work and to do it consistently and to do it with intention. This comes back a bit to, I think that Nabil asked me a little bit about optimism. We've had periods where things were super politicized, that the pendulum swung back again too. So I'm like, I think that's just that. I think it's like it takes courage, it takes the willingness to speak up, it needs to have clarity on that. And I think it's also like deep down this sense that we're part of we're part of a community of people where the better argument should win, and it should never ever be given up. It's just that.
But here, for instance, the government from the beginning did not permit an A-B discussion of this.
Mm-hmm.
No, it was the political side was settled. And what you're saying sounds more like a dream world. Yeah. The closest I can remember was eugenics in the 1920s, where the academic world was very supportive of it. In that case, there was even the Weinberg-Hardy theorem that disproved it, but it didn't matter.
Yeah, I think here's what I would say. The fact that there are episodes, right, where you have consensus or fake consensus or whatever it is, mm-hmm. and voices are suppressed, and then those voices turn out later to be right or vindicated, that's true, right? And I think that we can all have examples along those lines, but I don't think that changes fundamentally what the principles are and what our responsibility is on that. It just means sometimes we lose, yeah. And I think that's true.
No,
and there are the bigger forces that push that through, and that's true.
Yeah, the question is, can universities in any way be a bastion?
Yeah, I think yes.
Okay.
I think yes, but it's like it requires this is there's a good German word, Zivilcourage, which is kind of the courage of the everyday. It's like the courage of the everyday, and that's not easy, but that's what needs to happen. It's when something doesn't sound right, to name it and to speak up to it, and especially for the people that can afford to do it. That's I think that's what it comes down to, Richard. And then sometimes you lose, and then you dust yourself up and you try again.
One could always hope.
One can hope springs eternal, right? Yeah.
So I don't see further hands, so I want to follow up quickly on the question I asked earlier. So I asked you about institutional neutrality beyond leading administrators, across administrators and faculty, and you gave me a very nice sort of general philosophical answer on how it should be applied throughout the university. I was hoping you might have some thoughts or tell us a bit about what you as a chancellor can do or do to give incentives for this or punishments for those who don't act in a neutral way, because that seems key to me. Not just everyone should act neutrally, but how do we change a whole host of administrators and faculty who have internalized for their entire career that they're not supposed to act neutrally?
Incentives and punishments was the question, right? In this particular case, so my sense here is that a lot of the work of a dean, right, is a lot more about that is about cajoling and, you know, like it's soft power, if I may say it that way, right? A lot of that is soft power. And if the dean doesn't do that job, then the dean shouldn't be the dean. You know, I mean, that's that. But I think the idea that this is more practice and leadership question about how you get this stuff done. But my sense is that has a lot more hope. You know, is to connect with people in a way that brings them back to what their common values are. To have them refocus on what it is that we all agree on, you know, and what we share as as members of an academic community. I found that more effective than punishments and incentives on that. That's just my experience on that. I think that people are very often, they really get worked up over a specific issue because it's really personal, very important to them, and there's a bringing them back to like a sense of kind of this is the standard, this is the values. It doesn't always work, but it's it's like, I don't think this is fundamentally different with people not doing their job in other parts of the university too. And you can, this is what you do. You have like you have conversations. You say like, well, that So I don't think that the draconian language that you brought is really. That's not how I would do it. That's my sense. But if leaders systematically don't do that, or they're not in line with that, the department chairs or deans, they have to be removed. Of course, that'd be my sense.
Okay. So we are at noon already. So why don't we just take one more question? Why don't you, Amy, ask the last question here?
Okay, I don't mean to go over time here, but listening to you, and of course I agree with so much of what you say. I think one of the big problems, and we haven't come up with a solution, is that prestigious selective universities have just way too much power as gatekeepers, as makers and breakers of young people and their future and their career. And this has been driven home to me recently. This is confidential for now, but I am about to be punished and penalized for speaking out vociferously against my university's DEI policies. I've been accused of inequitably targeted disrespect, that of being a racist, basically. And it looks like my university is going to get away with that, even though, of course, it's preposterous and absurd and, violates every basic principle of academic free expression. But when my attorney and the Associate General Counsel of the university had some discussions about this, could it be settled? And of course it couldn't, because I wasn't going to give up anything. The University General Counsel said to my lawyer, we don't really care if you sue us. We don't care what you do. We will survive it. Our dean can be shown to be a shambolic liar. That is the expression he used, a perjurer, a drug addict or whatever it is they're accusing him of to violating every academic principle, and we will get away with it. Why? We will get past it. We are the Ivy League. And as long as the students keep applying, the alumni shut up, the federal money keeps flowing, we're good. So it does not matter. Your client will lose. That's me. Okay? Now, what we need to do is figure out how to address that.
Oh boy, that's like a whole new, set of issues here, right? I think I think your assessment that these elite institutions have an enormous amount of influence and impact is right. I think that's correct. I think they are, there is a lot of, the moat is very high, if I may put it this way, right? I mean, it's like it's the alumni, it's the reputation, it's all that stuff, and that's a bigger question about what's the competitive environment for research university and what should it be. I don't disagree with the point that they're mighty resilient, in this case. They're very hard to move on that. And the value of being, a Penn or Harvard or Yale graduate is very, very high. And that's the equilibrium that we're dealing with in this case. It's a really interesting observation that I think the last great, private university was founded in 1900. That's a long time. And we're all having like 150th or in the case of Harvard, 400 university. Very, very hard to break into that. Very hard. Which is also, by the way, I think that all this talk that I always hear that, the next technology will just disrupt us, wake me up, once I have a little evidence for that. But it's like we are very, very, we have a very high moat. In a whole variety of, and then what the many pieces that play with. And what I would say, Amy, on that, it comes with responsibility. That's the flip side of that, right? The responsibility that we carry is enormous, and it includes, we're a shared governance institution. So I think it's great that we're talking about the responsibility of administrators, and I totally buy that. That's what I do. But the faculty and groups of faculty, they'll have to be part of that process as well.
All right. Well,
Professor Swiebel,
we are over time, but let me thank you so much, Daniel, for